In the year 1995, a hiker got lost in the remote mountains of Oregon. The local community believed he had contracted an animal virus known as hill fever, while the natives referred to it as the wolf's face. We then meet Blake, a young man raised under the strict discipline of his father, Mr. Grady, who trained him as if he were raising a soldier. Every morning, Blake was awakened with firm orders, and during breakfast, his father informed him that they would be leaving to hunt exactly at 7 o'clock. Before embarking on their journey, father and son would pause to admire the view that always left them in awe, even after seeing it so many times. They traversed the meadows and crossed rivers, and while exploring the forest, Blake learned to identify which mushrooms were edible and which should be avoided. However, the boy's attention was not always constant, leading Grady to caution him about the dangers of the forest, emphasizing the importance of always being alert. He often reminded Blake that death could come at any moment and that he might not always be able to protect him. Soon they spotted a deer, and Grady prepared to hunt it, but the animal vanished among the trees. When he looked back at Blake, he was horrified to find that the boy had disappeared. Trying to get a better view, Blake had stepped off the trail and, at that moment, spotted the figure of a large, strange being in front of him. Though the sight was brief, the shock froze him in place, but after not seeing it again, he slowly decided to retrace his steps. Suddenly, his father appeared behind him, startling him and yelling furiously for him to have wandered off. Trying to contain his anger, he managed to calm down, but both began to hear unsettling noises coming from the forest. They decided to seek shelter in a nearby hunting cabin, where Grady told Blake to cover his ears. Outside, they could hear distant creaks, grotesque on the wooden steps, as if something heavy were climbing. The monster failed to open the cabin door and eventually left, leaving deep marks in the wood. After ensuring they were safe, Grady surveyed the surroundings and discovered that the deer they had attempted to hunt had been brutally devoured by some wild beast. Staying alert, he managed to shoot a part of the creature watching them. At home, Grady chose to reassure his son, saying they had only faced one of the many bears in the forest. However, Blake secretly saw him contacting someone via radio, confessing to having seen the wolf's face. Grady was absolutely certain it was real and that he had nearly shot it. He insisted that he was not looking for trouble, that he was only hunting deer with his son, but now he was determined to capture the creature to ensure his little one's safety. 30 years later, amid the hustle and bustle of the big city, we see Blake again, this time with his daughter. They are about to head home when the little girl accidentally bumps into a disturbingly looking man. Blake, noticing the situation, quickly intervenes to help her, although he can't help but scold her afterward. However, upon reflection, he realizes that his reaction was not the best and, with a sigh of regret, apologizes for getting upset, telling Ginger to be more careful next time. Later, Blake plays with his daughter until Charlotte, his wife, returns from work. She greets them both and hands her husband an envelope containing her father's will, who recently passed away. After a brief exchange of words, she tries to take an important call, but Blake, oblivious to the call's relevance, interrupts her, triggering a sharp response from Charlotte, revealing that their marriage faces unresolved issues. Once they both calm down, Blake tells her that the letter is not just a will, but also the official death certificate of his father. With a mixture of nostalgia and sadness, he confesses that, although he knew this moment would come, he cannot help but feel affected. He expresses regret for not having known his father better. Blake then shares his decision to return to his father's house to organize his belongings. He seizes the opportunity to suggest that Charlotte and Ginger accompany him and spend the summer there, away from the city's hustle and bustle. He talks about the valleys between the mountains he used to contemplate, a place that always brought him a deep sense of peace. Blake also proposes that she works remotely so that she can spend more time with Ginger and, in that process, find inspiration for her book. Charlotte, in turn, reveals her doubts. She is unsure of her role as a mother and admits that she feels she doesn't have much in common with her daughter, who now seems to be spending more time with Blake. But he, with a calm voice, reassures her, saying that she is still a wonderful mother and insists that she come with them, trusting that this experience will help them reconnect as a family. A few days later, the family is driving along vast roads toward Oregon. Along the way, the couple plays a guessing game with their daughter, sharing pleasant moments and strengthening their family bond. At one point, Blake stops, confused about the correct road. The lack of signal on his GPS forces him to pull out a physical map to try to locate himself. Meanwhile, Ginger notices a man watching them from a nearby checkpoint. Charlotte, worried, suggests they leave immediately upon realizing the man is armed, but Blake reassures her, explaining that it is common for people to carry guns in the mountains of Oregon. When he sees the man approaching, Blake rolls down the window, ready to talk. The stranger asks where they are going, and Blake replies that he is looking for his father's farm. He explains that he hasn't been there in years and mentions who his father was. As soon as the man hears the name, he immediately recognizes it and introduces himself as Derek, the son of an old friend of Blake's father. Surprised, Blake also recognizes him and, after a brief conversation, asks how he is doing. Derek mentions that many families in the area have decided to move, reminding them that the mountains can be inhospitable at night due to the lack of light and electricity. Blake explains that he is just trying to get to his father's house, but Derek informs him that they are actually at the entrance to his own property. Derek offers to guide them so they won't need to return to the main road. With no time to argue, Charlotte moves to the back seat with Ginger, and Derek gets into the vehicle. As they drive, Blake takes the chance to introduce his family, and together they begin their journey toward the farm. As they approach their destination, Derek seizes the opportunity to ask Blake about his work. Blake says he is a writer, although he is currently unemployed, and that he is dedicating all his time to taking care of his daughter in the back seat. Charlotte, for her part, mentions that she works as a journalist. After listening to them, Derek comments that Blake must look at them every day and wonder how he built such a beautiful family. Blake responds with a firm yes. However, at that moment, turning his attention back to the road, he sees something unexpected in the middle of it. He doesn't have enough time to stop, and the only option he sees is to swerve violently. The vehicle loses control and ends up rolling down a steep slope, taking the whole family and their new companion along with it. When Blake wakes up after the collision, he immediately checks to see if his wife and daughter are okay. The truck is now precariously hung between the trees. Amid the chaos, Derek desperately tries to open the door, but as he does so, he falls hard to the ground. Blake then tells his wife and daughter to exit through the window. Once they are safe, he hurries to follow them. However, Blake begins to feel a disturbing presence, something moving in the shadows of the dark forest. He barely manages to close the passenger door when suddenly a bestial creature approaches at incredible speed, shattering the window with immense force and attacking Derek ruthlessly, dragging him into the darkness of the forest. Blake, with no time to process what happened, leads his family to the top of the truck. He descends first and then helps his wife and daughter to safety. Unbeknownst to them, they are being pursued. Faced with the growing tension, they decide to run through the dark forest, exhausted, with Ginger carried in her father's arms. Blake insists that he recognizes the path and says they are close to the farm. When they finally spot the building ahead, he encourages them to run as fast as they can, hearing the deafening roar of the creature approaching in the night's darkness. They manage to reach the house safe and sound, and as soon as they close the door, they hear the fierce scratching of the beast trying to get in before it finally retreats. Blake, with a flashlight in hand, walks around the house, inspecting the exterior, making sure the danger has passed. Then he descends to the basement, trying to figure out how to turn on the lights. Although it seems he broke something when fiddling with the switches, the farmhouse lights eventually turn on. Back with his family, Blake reassures them, saying the danger has passed, and takes Ginger to a room, trying to calm her and help her rest. The little girl, in tears, expresses how much she wants to go home. Blake gently explains that it is still not possible and that they will have to wait until dawn. Throughout the night, Blake remains alert, keeping an eye out for any sign from outside. When Blake joins Charlotte, he tells her they need to reinforce the entrances, but she, visibly shaken, can only ask what that creature that was chasing them was. Blake admits he isn't sure and believes it could be an animal, although he swears that while they were still on the road, he saw the creature standing as if it were a person. Despite her doubts, he spends the rest of the night reinforcing the doors, knowing that any effort would be in vain if the beast truly wanted to get in. Charlotte suggests they try to call for help, but the lack of signal seems to trap them. In response, Blake shows her an old radio system that belonged to his father. Although they try to communicate, they receive no response. Then a foul smell catches Blake's attention. Curious, he follows the aroma and discovers a refrigerator filled with dried meat, likely left by Grady. Upon eating a piece, he injures his chin and, to his horror, ends up spitting out a whole tooth as his face starts to swell. Charlotte tries to help him, and it is then that she notices an injury on his arm, quickly cleaning and bandaging it. Blake thinks he may have cut himself on the truck's glass during the attack, but Charlotte is not so sure. Although the process is painful, he is thankful for her help and asks her to try to contact someone again via the radio. As the minutes pass, the pressure to protect his family begins to overwhelm Blake, knowing that his attempts to communicate have been in vain, and he asks for a moment to think. However, he finds no peace. Instead of resting, he spends hours reinforcing the entrances while Charlotte tries to sleep and calm down. The wound on his arm hinders his work, and soon he begins to feel sick. Sweat drenches his clothes, and while he tries to clean himself in the kitchen, a strange noise, like footsteps on wooden flooring, interrupts him. Following the sound, Blake locates it upstairs. Gathering his courage, he ascends to the floor above. There, he discovers an enormous spider that seems to disorient him for a moment. We see him stumble, but he quickly regains control. However, something about him seems different now. With altered behavior, he returns to the living room, where everything feels strangely out of place. He finds his wife and tells her to be quiet. Blake insists the beast is hunting them, and through the window, he spots it wandering around the house. He begins to act strangely, convinced that he can sense things beyond the door when suddenly, the monster bursts in, breaking the fragile wooden board in an attempt to grab his foot. Charlotte, armed with a hammer, manages to save him, although his leg is severely injured. Later, Blake wakes up on the sofa, his leg throbbing with pain, and realizes it is almost 2 in the morning. With effort, he gets up and leaves the room. He soon hears the strange noise again, like a bizarre howl. However, going to see his family, it is noticeable that Blake is not hearing real screams but rather hearing his wife's voice distorted into grotesque and unnatural sounds. Meanwhile, Charlotte desperately tries to get help through the radio. She speaks urgently and fearfully, explaining that her husband is gravely ill. She recounts that they were attacked by an unknown creature and fears Blake may have been infected. Unsure if anyone is listening, she tirelessly pleads for help, confessing that her husband seems unaware of his own deterioration and that she doesn't know what to do. Suddenly, Charlotte feels a presence in the room. She turns and finds Blake hiding in the shadows, murmuring incomprehensibly. Slowly, his face begins to change, the human features disappear, replaced by something strange and terrifying. Charlotte, deeply concerned, speaks to him softly, reminding him how much she loves him and assuring him that everything will be alright, but when Blake loses control and soils himself, she decides to take him to bed so he can rest. Blake's deterioration continues to advance, his hair begins to fall out, his face loses its human traits, and his ability to speak completely fades away. Charlotte, trying to communicate with him, hands him a notebook and a marker so he can express what he's feeling. Blake writes with great difficulty that he is dying. She, trying to remain calm, responds that he is just sick, that it's something temporary and that he won't even notice when he gets better. Filled with love and desperation, Charlotte assures him that everything will be okay because they're daughter and she need him. She confesses that she cannot imagine a life without him, her partner and best friend. However, from Blake's perspective, the world begins to change, colors become strange, and his wife's words cease to make sense. When he tries to tell her that he doesn't understand anymore, Charlotte responds with the same words, trying to stay calm. Charlotte tells her daughter that everything will be alright, that they just need to wait until dawn to take him to the doctor. In the meantime, Blake rises from the sofa, but all that comes from him are weak howls. Charlotte, alarmed, notices that the wound on her husband's arm looks horrifically bad. Upon completely removing the bandage, Blake panics and rushes to a corner where he begins to scratch frantically to relieve the itching. At that moment, another of his teeth falls to the floor, and his gaze appears vacant, revealing a terrifying helplessness indicating that his human side is rapidly disappearing. The man exits the room with an expression filled with sorrow and pain, a suffering that Charlotte cannot comprehend. In response, she decides to move toward the window, where she notices a truck parked nearby. Without hesitation, she heads to the basement in search of the keys to the vehicle, also grabbing a battery and a knife to protect herself if necessary. Charlotte then leads her family in a quiet escape. The three reach the truck, and Charlotte manages to put her husband in the back seat, with her daughter settling in the vehicle as well. With everything ready, the responsibility of starting the engine falls on her. However, the atmosphere inside the truck becomes tense, and Ginger, terrified, avoids looking directly at her father, who has begun to transform completely. Meanwhile, Charlotte hurriedly attempts to start the engine, but her initial attempts are noisy and unsuccessful. Amid the chaos, Blake has already changed irreversibly. Suddenly, a spark of hope lights up Charlotte's face. She finally manages to start the vehicle. But when she tries to clean the windshield, she faces a terrifying sight. A horrific figure is standing in front of the truck, a grotesque being that violently shatters the glass and yanks the gear lever. The family, overtaken by panic, runs toward a nearby greenhouse, dragging Blake with them, who barely retains any trace of his former identity. However, they seek shelter on a fragile surface that begins to give under the weight of Ginger. Meanwhile, the werewolf lurks under the greenhouse and, with its claws, begins to tear the structure from below, trying to reach them. Desperate, Ginger tries to move closer to her parents to avoid falling, but the canvas that supports her partially tears, leaving half of her body exposed to the beast. Just when the creature is about to grab her, an unexpected act interrupts it. Filled with courage, Blake tells Charlotte and their daughter to go back to the house. Though the idea unsettles her, Charlotte agrees. In a final act of humanity, Blake leaps from the greenhouse and runs into the forest, managing to distract the creature. The two, consumed by despair, run back to the house, hearing the fierce roars and the sound of claws scratching the trees. Upon reaching the house, they manage to lock themselves in, but the tension inside quickly intensifies. Ginger accuses her mother of abandoning her father, blaming her for what may be his death. Charlotte, however, tries to explain that it was all for protection, and that both risked their lives for her. Suddenly, the roars from outside stop, catching Charlotte's attention. Looking through the window, she sees Blake outside, although his appearance is now completely different. Moved by her daughter's pleas, she decides to open the door. Blake, now unrecognizable, stumbles into the living room, moving awkwardly and breathing heavily. Ginger, convinced that he is still her father, tries to approach him, ignoring the threatening signs his presence emits. Charlotte, in a state of contained panic, watches, aware that the line between humanity and monstrosity has completely vanished in Blake. In the end, he succumbs to the closeness of his little daughter, who, with tenderness, places her hand on his forehead and, as if playing one of her innocent games, asks what he is thinking. Although the child reminds him of how much he loves her and shows clear concern, Blake can only hear incoherent murmurs from his little one. Suddenly, what was once Blake begins to writhe in pain on the floor. His claws, now more reminiscent of nightmares than human limbs, lose their nails as he vomits a thick, reddish substance mixed with clots and repellent remnants. Amid the mess, he manages to spot a human finger. Charlotte tries to move closer to her daughter to protect her, but Blake prevents her, trapping her in the grip of his claws and forcing her to face the monster he has become. However, in a brief moment of clarity, Blake makes a desperate decision to step away to protect them, but as soon as he opens the door to leave, the first werewolf, who seemed to have disappeared, attacks him furiously, delivering a brutal beating. The two werewolves engage in a fierce struggle, and their roars tear through the air like a terrifying echo. Charlotte, overwhelmed by fear and instinct, grabs a knife and tries to strike the other creature as she searches for a chance to escape with Ginger. But the monster, far from giving up, becomes even more terrifying. It continues to fight even after losing its fingers. When it seems ready to chase them, Blake intervenes again, facing the invader to save his family. However, the battle does not last long. The wounded and exhausted Blake loses the confrontation. Charlotte, determined to help him, prepares to intervene, but watches in horror as the first werewolf drags Blake outside. Charlotte reacts quickly and tries to attack the beast, and fortunately at that moment, Blake returns with unexpected strength and finishes off his opponent by viciously biting its throat. When the creature falls, Blake notices a distinctive tattoo on his opponent's arm. In disbelief, he does not realize that the creature he fought to protect his wife and daughter was actually his own father. Aware of his irreversible transformation, Blake decides to leave the house as quickly as possible. Charlotte, shattered by pain, watches as he walks toward the outside, where his metamorphosis continues. He writhes on the ground, his body contorting in indescribable agony. His chest seems to change from within, and the nails detach to give way to long claws, and his jaw and cheekbones transform, adapting to an environment that he now perceives as his. Inside the house, Ginger, confused and upset, asks her mother why her father turned like this. Charlotte, with a lump in her throat, explains that Blake's father disappeared in the forest a long time ago, and everyone thought he was dead, but that was not the case. He contracted the same strange illness that eventually passed on to his son. The little girl, with tears in her eyes, expresses how much she wishes her father could go back to being as he once was. Charlotte, trying to comfort her, leans towards her and assures her that she shares that wish with all her heart. She promises that she will always be there to take care of her, but suddenly, the lights in the house go out, plunging them into oppressive darkness. Charlotte looks out the window and sees what was once her husband, now transformed into a horrific monster, with prominent fangs and empty eyes that reflect no recognition. As she quickly pulls away from the window, Charlotte feels a chill run down her spine, and the certainty that both she and her daughter are being hunted by this new, terrifying creature settles in her mind. Determined to protect them, she grabs a knife while trying to reassure her daughter, saying that everything will be alright. With slow and cautious steps, she heads to the stairs, but when she turns to check on Ginger, her heart stops when she sees Blake standing right behind her, the image of the grotesque and threatening werewolf shocking her so much that, in a desperate act of bravery, she tightens her fist around the knife, ready to defend herself and protect her little one. Blake, consumed by his instincts, approaches with clear intentions of devouring them. His wife, with a movement full of determination, manages to wound him with the weapon, but the monster, far from retreating, grasps the knife with his own hands, indifferent to the pain, while the blade cuts into his flesh. The scene is pure terror, but Charlotte and Ginger, driven by fear and the survival instinct, manage to escape the house and take refuge in a dark shed. Inside, Charlotte finds an iron chain, which she quickly grabs as an improvised weapon, as the creature has already reached the doors of their refuge. The being pushes and pounds with supernatural strength, trying to get in. Finally, the threatening sounds cease, and Charlotte thinks for a moment that the danger has passed. However, in the shadows, the werewolf has managed to infiltrate without either of them noticing. The monster takes one more step toward them but falls into a bear trap that Charlotte had set. The tension relieves for a moment when she turns on the lantern in her hands, revealing Blake's grotesque figure, now trapped. Seizing the opportunity, mother and daughter flee the shed, leaving the monster behind, but the beast is unwilling to give up its prey. In an act of brutality, it tears off the trapped leg with its own teeth, freeing itself from the trap at an unimaginable cost. Now, the werewolf crawls out of the barn and, despite its injury, advances through the forest in search of its victims. Charlotte and Ginger run without looking back, pushing through the dense vegetation of bushes and trees. The monster's roar, deep and terrifying, echoes in the air, forcing them to move faster. In the middle of nowhere, Charlotte comes across mutilated limbs and belongings scattered near the truck they arrived in. Quickly, Charlotte hands the lantern to her daughter and begins to look for a solution, but when she looks up, both see the werewolf perched on the vehicle, staring at them. With no other choice, they resume their flight. Finally, the darkness of the night begins to fade with the first light of dawn. Mother and daughter find shelter in an old hunting lodge, a place heavy with dark memories. It was here, years ago, that Blake hid with his father while hunting, pursued by a creature very similar to the one he has now become. But unlike the former werewolf, he decides to peek, only to stop when he sees Ginger visibly terrified. His daughter, with a pain in her heart, says that her father wants everything to end, but just at that moment, the fierce werewolf leaps to attack, only to be stopped by a shot fired by his wife. In the end, the two manage to save themselves, but not without losing Blake in the process. When the beast takes its last breath, Charlotte understands that she has lost both her husband and her best friend. With this painful realization, both women leave the forest behind, crossing the valley he